The door wasn't supposed to open, but it did. No resistance, no hesitation, just a soft click as the handle turned in my hand, and suddenly I was standing inside their apartment, uninvited, unnoticed, and completely aware of what I was doing. For a second, I just stood there in the dark, letting the silence settle around me, and instead of guilt, instead of fear, all I felt was a strange, quiet sense of validation. Because this right here, this exact moment, was proof that everything they had laughed at me for actually mattered. And if you've ever had someone dismiss your fears, make you feel small for caring about your own safety, then you already understand why I didn't turn around and leave. You understand why I stepped further inside. When I first moved out of my parents' house, I thought I was stepping into independence, into freedom, into a version of myself that didn't need to double-check locks or worry about worst-case scenarios. I thought adulthood meant feeling in control. But the reality hit differently. I was 20, living in my first apartment, and instead of feeling independent, I felt exposed in ways I wasn't ready for. The apartment wasn't terrible, but it wasn't safe either. It was the kind of place where police cars showed up so often that eventually you stopped reacting to the sirens. Late-night shouting outside became background noise, something you learned to ignore even when it made your chest tighten slightly. And the worst part was how quickly that environment starts to feel normal, even when deep down your instincts are telling you it's not. I lived with Joel and Sadie, people I knew from school, not close friends but familiar enough that moving in together didn't feel like a risk at the time. Joel was 24, a medical student with this calm, detached confidence that only comes from knowing you'll be fine no matter what happens. His family had money, and you could see it in the way he reacted to problems, like everything was temporary, replaceable, insignificant. Sadie was the same in a different way. She was relaxed, dismissive, always laughing things off like nothing was serious enough to deserve concern. They matched each other perfectly, always on the same page, always backing each other up, and without realizing it at first, I became the odd one out in that dynamic. The one who noticed things. The one who worried. The one who didn't just brush everything aside. At first, things were manageable. We kept to ourselves, respected each other's space, split rent evenly, and for a short while, it felt like this might actually work. But then small things started happening, things that didn't seem huge individually, but slowly built into something heavier. It started with Joel mentioning that someone had gone through his car overnight. He said it so casually, like it didn't matter, like it was just one of those things that happens. A few days later, Sadie said the same thing happened to her. Again with that same careless tone, like it was barely worth acknowledging. Then it happened to me, and I remember walking up to my car and feeling something was off before I even saw it. That instinct hit first, that quiet warning you can't explain, and then I noticed my glove compartment slightly open, just enough to confirm that someone had been there, someone had touched my things, someone had stood exactly where I was standing. That feeling didn't leave quickly. It stayed in my chest, heavy and uncomfortable, not because of what was taken but because of what it meant. Our space wasn't secure. Our environment wasn't safe. And from that moment on, I started noticing everything. The people lingering in the parking lot, the broken lights that never got fixed, the strange sounds at night that suddenly felt more significant. Everything added up, and naturally my attention shifted to something that should have been simple, something that should have been non-negotiable. The door. At first, it was just something I noticed in passing. I would come home and realize it wasn't locked, not wide open, not obvious, just unlocked enough that anyone could walk in if they wanted to. The first time, I ignored it. The second time, I mentioned it casually, trying not to make it a big deal. I remember saying, "Hey, can we just make sure the door is locked when we leave?" And Joel barely reacted, just nodding like he wasn't really listening. Sadie smiled, but not in agreement, more like amusement, and said something along the lines of me worrying too much. I laughed it off in that moment, but something about it didn't sit right with me. Because I wasn't trying to be dramatic. I wasn't trying to control anything. I was just asking for something basic, something reasonable, something that should have already been happening without me needing to say it. But it didn't stop. It kept happening over and over again, and every time I walked up to that door and realized it wasn't locked, I felt the same tightness in my chest, the same quiet frustration building a little more each time. I started checking the apartment when I walked in, not because I wanted to, but because I felt like I had to. I would glance at the corners, listen for any unusual sounds, sometimes even pause before fully stepping inside. It sounds dramatic when you say it out loud, but in the moment, it didn't feel dramatic, it felt necessary. And every time I brought it up, it turned into the same conversation, the same dismissive reactions, the same subtle ridicule that made me feel like I was the problem. They would tell me I was overthinking, that nothing was going to happen, that even if something did happen, it wouldn't matter because things could be replaced. That part always stuck with me, because for them, replacing things was easy. For me, it wasn't. My laptop wasn't just another item, it was essential. It was something I depended on for work, something I couldn't afford to lose. But no matter how I tried to explain that, it never really landed. I remember one night clearly, more than the others, because it was the moment I realized nothing I said was going to change anything. I came home exhausted, mentally drained, already looking forward to just being alone and decompressing, and as I reached the door, I already knew before I touched it. That instinct again. And sure enough, it was unlocked. I stood there for a second longer than usual, staring at it, feeling that mix of frustration and helplessness settle in my chest, because it wasn't just about the door anymore. It was about being ignored, about not being taken seriously, about living in a space where my sense of security didn't matter. When I walked inside, they were sitting there like everything was normal, laughing at something on TV, completely relaxed, completely unbothered. And in that moment, something shifted inside me, not loudly, not dramatically, but quietly, like a small crack forming that would eventually turn into something bigger. Because I realized then that this wasn't going to stop, not because they forgot, but because they didn't care enough to remember. And that realization stayed with me. After that night, nothing visibly changed, but internally, everything did. Before, I used to give them the benefit of the doubt. I told myself they were just forgetful, that maybe they weren't used to thinking about things like this, that eventually they would understand. But after a while, it became impossible to ignore the pattern. This wasn't forgetfulness anymore. It was a choice. Every single time they walked out of that apartment and left the door unlocked, they weren't just leaving behind a habit, they were leaving behind my sense of safety, like it was something optional, something trivial. And what made it worse wasn't just the action itself, it was the way they reacted when I tried to talk about it, like my concern was something to laugh at rather than something to respect. I started becoming hyper-aware of everything around me. Locking the door wasn't just something I did anymore, it became a ritual. I would check it once, then check it again, then pause for a second before leaving just to make sure I heard that click properly. It wasn't paranoia the way they described it, it was adaptation. When you live in an environment that constantly reminds you it isn't safe, your mind doesn't relax, it sharpens. But the frustrating part was that no matter how careful I became, I couldn't control what they did when I wasn't there. That lack of control started to weigh on me more than anything else. It's one thing to protect yourself, but it's another to feel like the people you live with are quietly undoing that protection every chance they get. One evening, I came home earlier than usual. My schedule had shifted unexpectedly, and for once, I wasn't mentally prepared for what I might find. As I walked up the stairs, I felt that familiar tension creeping in, that subtle instinct warning me that something was off. And when I reached the door, I didn't even need to try the handle to know. I could already feel it. Still, I turned it and it opened immediately. Unlocked. Again. But this time it was different. The apartment was completely empty. No voices, no TV, no movement. Just silence. Thick, uncomfortable silence that made every small sound feel amplified. I stood there in the doorway for a few seconds, not stepping in right away. My mind started running through scenarios automatically, things I didn't want to think about but couldn't stop. What if someone had already come in? What if they were still inside? What if I walked into something I couldn't handle? It sounds dramatic when you say it out loud, but in that moment, it didn't feel dramatic, it felt real. Slowly, I stepped inside, my body tense, my movements cautious. I checked the living room first, then the kitchen, then the hallway, my eyes scanning corners, doorways, shadows. Everything looked normal, untouched. But the feeling didn't go away. Even after I confirmed that I was alone, my body stayed tense, like it didn't trust the conclusion my eyes had reached. I sat down on the couch, trying to calm myself, but it took longer than it should have. My heart rate was still slightly elevated, my breathing just a little too shallow. And sitting there in that quiet apartment, I realized something I hadn't fully acknowledged before. This wasn't just about a door anymore. This was about the constant mental strain of never feeling secure in your own space. It was about walking into your own home and having to question whether it was still yours in that moment. It was exhausting in a way that's hard to explain to someone who's never felt it. When Joel and Sadie came back later that evening, I brought it up again, but this time, there was a firmness in my voice that hadn't been there before. I wasn't asking anymore, I was stating a fact. You left the door unlocked again. The apartment was completely empty. I expected, or maybe just hoped, that something in my tone would make them take it seriously this time. That maybe they'd finally understand that this wasn't a small issue to me. But instead, Joel let out this long, exaggerated sigh, like I had just interrupted something trivial with something even more trivial. Sadie gave this small laugh, shaking her head slightly, as if she couldn't believe I was still stuck on this. You make everything sound so intense, she said, her tone light, almost amused. And then Joel said it again, the same line that had been repeated in different forms so many times before, but somehow it hit harder this time. If something gets stolen, we'll just replace it. It's not that deep. That sentence lingered in the air longer than it should have. Not because of the words themselves, but because of what they revealed. To him, losing something wasn't a real loss. It was an inconvenience at worst. Something temporary, replaceable. But for me, that wasn't true. My laptop wasn't just an object. It was my work, my income, my stability. Losing it wouldn't just mean buying a new one. It would mean disruption, stress, possibly not being able to keep up with everything I depended on. But no matter how many times I tried to explain that, it never seemed to land. It was like we were living in two completely different realities under the same roof. I remember standing there, looking at both of them, realizing that there was no version of this conversation where they would suddenly understand. No explanation that would make them take it seriously. And that realization didn't make me angry in a loud, explosive way. It made something inside me go quiet. Because when you realize your voice doesn't carry weight in a space you live in, you stop expecting it to. After that, I stopped bringing it up as often. Not because it stopped bothering me, but because I knew how the conversation would go. The same dismissive tone, the same subtle mockery, the same feeling of being the only one who cared about something that should have been basic. But even though I stopped saying it out loud, the frustration didn't disappear. It built slowly, layering itself with every unlocked door, every casual laugh, every moment where I was made to feel like I was overreacting. And the worst part was, they didn't even see it happening. To them, everything was normal. To me, it was building into something I didn't fully understand yet, but I could feel it growing. Something quiet, something patient, something that was waiting. By the time I decided to move out, it didn't feel like a dramatic decision, it felt inevitable. There wasn't one explosive fight, no final argument where everything came crashing down at once. Instead, it was a slow erosion, a quiet wearing down of something that was supposed to feel like home, but never really did. Living there had turned into a constant balancing act between trying to feel safe and trying not to seem difficult, and over time, that balance became exhausting. I found myself spending more time outside the apartment than inside, lingering longer after work, taking unnecessary detours just to delay going back. And when you start avoiding your own home, that's when you know something isn't right. Maggie was the one who gave me an out. She was a friend from school, someone I trusted in a way I never fully trusted Joel and Sadie. When she mentioned that her current living situation wasn't working out and she was thinking about moving, something immediately clicked in my mind. It wasn't even a complicated decision. It felt like relief before it even happened. We found another unit in the same complex, nothing fancy, nothing significantly better, but it had one crucial difference. It felt like a space where I wouldn't have to fight to be heard. Where something as simple as locking the door wouldn't turn into a debate. The day I moved out, Joel and Sadie treated it like it was nothing. No tension, no awkwardness, just casual goodbyes like we were all still on perfectly normal terms. "See you around," Sadie said with a small smile, like we hadn't spent months clashing over something that mattered deeply to me. Joel gave a quick nod, already half distracted, like my leaving didn't register as significant in any way. And that, more than anything, confirmed what I had already started to accept. They never really saw things from my perspective, and they probably never would. Moving in with Maggie was different in a way I felt immediately. It wasn't about the apartment itself, it was about the atmosphere. The first night we were there, I remember locking the door and hearing that solid, reassuring click, and instead of feeling tense, I felt something I hadn't felt in a while. Relief. Maggie didn't question it, didn't joke about it, didn't make me feel like I was overreacting. It was just understood. Normal. And that alone made the space feel safer than anywhere I had lived in months. But even after I left, the memory of living with Joel and Sadie didn't just disappear. It lingered in small ways. In habits I couldn't break, like checking the door multiple times before going to bed. In the way I still scanned rooms automatically when I entered, even though I knew, logically, that I was safe now. And sometimes, when I saw them in the parking lot, there was this strange mix of familiarity and distance. We would exchange quick greetings, polite but surface level, like everything between us had been neatly packed away and labeled as not important. But every time I saw them, I couldn't help but think about those months, about how something so simple had turned into something so frustrating. Then there was the way they handled everything else, especially during that time. They didn't take anything seriously, not the neighborhood, not the break-ins, not even the pandemic that was happening all around us. They lived like consequences didn't apply to them, like everything would always work out no matter what. And maybe for them, that had always been true. But watching that mindset from the outside, after everything I had experienced living with them, only made me more aware of how disconnected our realities really were. For a while, that was it. Life moved on. I settled into my new routine with Maggie. Work continued. Days blended into each other the way they tend to do, when you're just trying to get through them. The tension I had lived with for months slowly started to fade, replaced by something steadier, something calmer. And for the most part, Joel and Sadie became background characters in my life, people I used to live with, nothing more. Until one evening something small happened. Something so minor, so insignificant on the surface, that it shouldn't have mattered. But it did. I was in the kitchen, cooking dinner alone. It was one of those quiet evenings where everything feels routine, predictable, almost peaceful. I had music playing softly in the background, ingredients laid out, everything moving at a steady pace. And then I reached for the potato peeler, and it wasn't there. At first, I didn't think much of it. I checked the usual drawer, then the sink, then the counter. Nothing. I paused, thinking maybe I had misplaced it earlier. Maybe it was in another cabinet. I checked again more thoroughly this time, moving things around, opening and closing drawers with a little more force than necessary. Still nothing. A small inconvenience. That's all it should have been. But as I stood there, staring into that empty drawer, something else started to surface. A memory. A feeling. The echo of all those times I had been dismissed. All those moments where something important to me had been treated like it didn't matter. And suddenly, it wasn't just about a missing kitchen tool anymore. It was about that familiar sense of frustration creeping back in, quiet but unmistakable. I needed that peeler to finish what I was making. It wasn't optional, not for that meal. And the first thought that came to my mind was simple, practical, reasonable. Joel and Sadie probably had one. For a moment I hesitated. Not because of the request itself, but because of everything attached to it. The history, the dynamic, the way interactions with them never quite felt neutral. But then I pushed that aside. This wasn't a big deal. It was just borrowing something. Normal roommate-adjacent behavior. So I left my apartment and walked over to their building. The air outside was cool, the kind of quiet evening where the world feels still, but not entirely peaceful. As I approached their door, I knocked. Once. Then again. I waited, listening for movement inside, for any sign that someone was home. Nothing. No footsteps. No voices. No sound at all. And that's when something shifted. It wasn't sudden. It wasn't dramatic. It was subtle, almost like a thought forming in the background before fully stepping into focus. I looked at the door. Just stood there for a second longer than necessary. Then, almost without thinking, I reached for the handle. The moment my fingers wrapped around the handle, I remember pausing for a fraction of a second that somehow felt much longer than it should have. It wasn't fear exactly, and it wasn't hesitation in the way people usually describe it. It was more like awareness, this quiet understanding that I was standing at the edge of something I couldn't undo once I crossed it. The hallway behind me was empty, the building was silent, and for a brief moment I could hear my own breathing more clearly than anything else. I turned the handle slowly, almost expecting resistance, almost expecting logic to step in and stop me. But there was none. The door clicked open with the same casual ease it always had, and that sound alone carried more weight than it should have. Standing there, looking into their apartment through a partially open door, I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't excitement, and it wasn't fear anymore. It was recognition. The same pattern again. The same carelessness. The same disregard for something that had been a constant source of anxiety for me. And yet here they were, living as if nothing in the world could touch them, as if consequences were something that only happened to other people. I didn't step inside immediately. I just stood there, letting my eyes adjust to the dim interior, listening for any sign of life. Nothing. No movement. No voices. Just an empty space that they had once again left completely unprotected. My first instinct should have been to walk away, to close the door, go back to my apartment and forget about it. That would have been the normal reaction, the safe reaction, the one that wouldn't complicate anything. But what made this moment different was that my mind didn't jump to fear or caution. It jumped to memory. Every time I had been brushed off, every time I had been told I was overreacting, every time I had been made to feel small for wanting something as simple as a locked door. It all came back at once, not in a chaotic wave, but in a structured, almost unsettling clarity. I finally stepped inside. The apartment was exactly as I remembered it, but somehow seeing it empty made it feel different. Softer. Vulnerable. The same couch where they used to sit and laugh off my concerns now sat in silence. The same kitchen where I had been dismissed so many times was now completely still. I moved slowly, not because I was scared, but because everything felt strangely unreal, like I was walking through a space that shouldn't have been accessible to me, and yet was. I told myself I was just going to ask for the peeler, nothing more. That was the original intention. That was the reasonable explanation I could still hold on to. I walked into the kitchen first, opening drawers carefully, scanning the counters. No one was there to stop me, no one was there to question me, and that fact alone made everything feel both easier and heavier at the same time. It took less than a minute to find it. The potato peeler. Small, ordinary, almost ridiculous in how insignificant it looked in that moment. I remember standing there holding it, realizing how absurd the situation was from an outside perspective. Walking into someone's apartment for something so minor. And yet, at the same time, it didn't feel minor. It felt symbolic in a way I couldn't fully articulate. Because this wasn't really about the peeler. It was about everything that led to this moment. I should have left right then. That would have been the end of it. A simple, forgettable interaction. But instead, I found myself standing there longer than necessary, my grip tightening slightly around the handle of the drawer I had just closed. My eyes drifted around the kitchen again, and without consciously deciding to, I noticed things I had ignored before. The unlocked balcony door. The slightly open window. The casual disregard for basic safety that had somehow become their normal. And in that quiet moment, something in me finally stopped trying to rationalize it. All those months of conversations replayed in my head. The dismissive smiles. The jokes. The way they made it seem like my concerns were childish. And suddenly, standing in their empty kitchen, I understood something that I hadn't fully accepted before. They weren't going to change. Not because they didn't understand, but because they didn't care to. And if they didn't care about their own safety, they certainly weren't going to care about how their behavior affected me. I walked back toward the door, peeler still in hand, and stopped just before stepping out. My eyes moved across the apartment one last time, and I felt this strange calm settle in. Not peace, not happiness, but clarity. The kind that comes when you stop expecting people to suddenly become different versions of themselves. In that moment, I made a decision, not loud, not emotional, not dramatic. Just quiet and final. I wasn't going to keep arguing. I wasn't going to keep trying to convince people who had already decided I wasn't worth listening to. I was just going to take what I needed from that moment and leave. And that's exactly what I did. I stepped out of their apartment, closed the door behind me gently, and walked back to my place like nothing unusual had happened. The peeler in my hand felt strangely insignificant now, but also oddly satisfying in a way I didn't want to overthink. Because deep down, I knew this wasn't really about stealing anything. It was about reclaiming a sense of control I had been slowly losing while living with them. A control I didn't even realize I had been missing until that exact moment. When I got back to my apartment, Maggie didn't even question it. She just kept cooking, unaware of what had just happened next door. And I didn't tell her. Not because I was ashamed, but because it didn't feel like something that needed explaining. It wasn't loud enough to be a story yet. It was just a moment. A quiet shift. A line I had crossed without even realizing how far I had stepped. But even then, I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't the end of the feeling. It was the beginning of something else. Something I hadn't fully named yet. Time didn't move differently after that night, but I did. On the surface, everything continued as normal. I still went to work, still cooked dinner, still talked to Maggie about random, everyday things that had nothing to do with what happened next door. But underneath that normal routine, there was a quiet awareness sitting in the background of my mind. Not guilt. Not regret. Something closer to closure. Even if it came from something so small it would sound ridiculous to anyone who didn't live through the same months I did. A few days passed before I saw Joel and Sadie again. It was outside, near the parking lot, one of those brief, accidental encounters that happens when people live in the same complex. They were laughing about something, completely absorbed in their own conversation, the same effortless confidence they always carried with them. For a moment, I just watched from a distance, not because I was scared of them, but because I was observing something I had finally detached myself from. They hadn't changed. They were still the same. Still careless, still dismissive, still living in a world where nothing really seemed to stick. They noticed me eventually. A quick wave, a casual, "Hey," like nothing had ever been wrong between us. I responded the same way. Polite, neutral, empty in a way that didn't invite anything further. There was no mention of the past, no awkward acknowledgement of unresolved tension. And that silence between us said more than any conversation could have. Because we all knew, in our own ways, that we weren't operating on the same understanding of reality. And strangely enough, I didn't feel the need to fix that anymore. That was the real shift. Not the moment I walked into their apartment. Not the moment I picked up that peeler. But this. This quiet acceptance that some people will never see things the way you do, no matter how clearly you explain it, no matter how reasonable your concerns are. And once you stop expecting them to understand, something inside you finally loosens. The days turned into weeks, and eventually, what happened that night became less of a sharp memory and more of a soft echo. I still had the peeler. It ended up in my kitchen drawer like any other ordinary tool, blending into my daily routine. Every now and then I would see it and think back, not with anger anymore, but with a kind of distant amusement. Because from the outside it really was nothing. Just a cheap kitchen item taken from an unlocked apartment. No confrontation. No dramatic fallout. No big revenge moment that anyone else would notice or care about. But for me, it represented something different. It represented the moment I stopped trying to be heard by people who had already decided not to listen. It represented the moment I stopped waiting for them to validate something I already knew was true. And maybe that's why it felt so satisfying. Not because of what I took, but because of the realization behind it. That I didn't need permission to protect my own sense of reality. I didn't need agreement to know when something was wrong. And I didn't need their acknowledgement to justify my own discomfort. Of course, life didn't suddenly become perfect after that. I didn't transform into someone fearless or completely unaffected by everything that came before. There were still moments where I caught myself double-checking locks, still moments where old habits resurfaced. But the emotional weight behind those actions started to fade. It was no longer anxiety driving them. It was just habit slowly dissolving into background noise. Joel and Sadie eventually faded out of my day-to-day life completely. We stopped running into each other as often. The occasional sighting became rare, then non-existent. And with distance came clarity. I started to see the entire situation not just as frustration, but as a lesson in how differently people can interpret the same environment. For them, that apartment had been just a cheap place to stay. For me, it had been a constant reminder of how fragile safety feels when the people around you don't take it seriously. And maybe that's the part that stayed with me the longest. Not the unlocked doors, not the arguments, not even the petty act that ended it all in my mind, but the realization that sometimes people don't need to do something extreme to hurt your sense of safety. Sometimes it's the repeated dismissal of something small that builds into something much larger inside you. Looking back now, years later, I don't see it as dramatic revenge. I see it as a moment where frustration finally found an outlet, even if it was quiet and almost absurd in its simplicity. And in a strange way, it marked the end of something I didn't fully know I needed to end. The need to be taken seriously by people who had already made up their minds. And honestly, that alone felt like enough justice. If this story hit you in any way, hit the like button and subscribe for more real-life revenge stories like this. And tell me in the comments, what's the smallest thing someone did that somehow became the most satisfying payback in your memory?